If you were living on the east coast of the United States in the 1800s and you heard there's a place to collect free gold and make millions by digging some holes, would you ride a horse 6 months to get there? This is All Request History. If you've ever wondered about the history of, well, anything, you're in the right place. Now, you're already here, so please hit the subscribe button. It'll only take a second, and it'll keep these videos going. Then put your request in the comments, and you could be the next All Request History. Thanks this time to Nate B9768. He's subscribed. Thanks, Nate, for requesting the history of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, during the height of the California Gold Rush, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was determined to make the country a more unified place. During his presidency, it took Americans 6 months to travel from the East Coast to the newly discovered West Coast to take part in the California Gold Rush and hopes of the American dream. Now, trains were gaining popularity during the 1800s, but there was no way to ride the rails all the way from the east to the west coast. The first railroad in the U.S. was the B&O in 1827, the Baltimore and Ohio, and by 1930, the first passenger train opened in South Carolina. By the time of the California Gold Rush began in 1848, there were close to 9,000 miles of railroad in the U.S., but you still couldn't take a train all the way across the country. In 1862, now close to 30,000 miles of rails, the 16th President Abraham Lincoln had a vision to connect the U.S. by rail and signed the Pacific Railway Act, which promoted the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, in 1866, as the Civil War ended, the American people were struggling to put their country back together again. Lincoln's Railway Act was a great way to unify the country. The plan was for his administration to subsidize and commission 2 companies to link one rail system through the U.S. Upon completion, Americans would be able to travel from one coast to the other in 7 days instead of 6 months. The 2 companies were, from Sacramento, California, the Central Pacific Railroad, and from Omaha, Nebraska, the newly formed company called Union Pacific Railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad started construction in 1863 from Sacramento and moved its way eastward. Theodore Denho Judah from Bridgeport, Connecticut, was the lead engineer and designer of the Central Pacific. He also found most of the investors that funded that project. The primary leaders of this company were known as the Big Four, and expectations were very high. The 4 men were 39-year-old California man Leland Stanford. He was an entrepreneur, businessman, and politician. Not only was he the financial brains behind this project, but fun fact, he and his wife Jane funded a school dedicated to their 15-year-old son they had lost to typhoid fever, Stanford University. The second and third men were business partners Mark Hopkins and Collins P. Huntington. Both failed gold rush miners turned capitalists. They led the charge in acting as the political lobbyists for the Central Pacific Railroad. Lastly, Charles Crocker from upstate New York dropped out of high school to support his family doing odd jobs and, like the others, wanted to catch gold in Northern California, but he also failed like the others and then found a way to run a successful business in California. He became a senator for that state, and his role was basically the brains behind the construction of the Central Pacific. These men, as well as many more, were the leaders of the Central Pacific Railroad. Leaders, yes, but who actually labored to build it? While construction was marked by the significant contribution of Chinese, German, and Irish immigrant laborers who played a crucial role in building the tracks through the rugged U.S. mountains. For the first few years, progress was painfully slow. Grueling work and terrible conditions often made workers quit and try their dream of gold mining. Facing a labor shortage, the railroad would then often employ children to help. By the spring of 1866, only 3 years after they started, the Central Pacific Railroad had only built 68 miles of track from Sacramento. This gained them the nickname by the public, the Tortoise. Now, if the public saw this as a race, and the Central Pacific as the tortoise, then the Union Pacific Railroad would be considered the hare. The Union Pacific started construction in Omaha, Nebraska in 1865. In the spring of '66, while Central Pacific was completing their 68th mile, Union Pacific had already cleared 200 miles with very few obstacles over the desert and plains. The Union Pacific employed over 10,000 workers, including Civil War veterans from both sides, former slaves, and many hard-working immigrants. This second company was run by Sidney Dillon, the son of a New York State farmer who worked his way up from water boy on the Hudson, New York Railroad to becoming the president of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1874 and served there for 10 years. Another key man to the project was Civil War Colonel Charles Francis Adams Jr. Adams failed to lead with any expectations, and Sidney Dillon was reinstated as the president in 1890. In close to financial ruin, Dillon took on sharp New York Railroad man and financier Thomas Durant as the vice president and general manager. Now, although Durant did help the railroad get back in good financial shape, it was later discovered that he and a few key people had lobbied Congress for double the construction costs and pocketed half the profits. At the end of his run, Durant and his crooked cronies had collected an estimated $23 million by defrauding the railroad. Despite the challenges by both railroad companies, Lincoln's dream of completion in 1869 came true at Promontory Summit, Utah, where the Union Pacific met the Central Pacific Railroad in a Golden Spike ceremony. This monumentous occasion was attended by over 1,000 people, including leaders from both businesses, rail workers, politicians, and proud U.S. citizens from near and far. The ceremony was led by a speech from several dignitaries, but most notable was led by Leland Stanford. When presenting the last Golden Spike to complete the railroad, he was quoted as saying, "Gentlemen of the Pacific Railroad, the last rail needed to complete the greatest railroad enterprise of the world is about to be laid." The spike on the east side of the completed rail was made of silver and represented the industrial eastern portion of the United States, and the spike on the western rail was made of gold, of course representing not only the California Gold Rush, but also opportunity and prosperity. So if you're on the East Coast and you want to get to the West Coast as soon as possible, you could book a flight and be there in like 6 hours, or you could stay in the ground and hop on a train, lay over in Chicago, maybe grab a deep dish pizza, and be in Sacramento, California in less than 3 days. And I don't know about you, but I can sleep a lot easier on the ground than I can at 20,000 feet. Well, thanks for checking in. Are you curious? Subscribe here, leave your request in the comments, and you could be the next All Request History.